The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by Fred LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.
Good day. My name is Fred LeFranc, and I'm the executive.
And I am Kristina Wiltsee, and I am the mystic. I would first, before we jump into the Executive and the Mystic podcast, like to introduce my co-host, the inimitable Fred LeFranc, who, in addition to having the most spectacular manifesting abilities of being able to bring in whatever he needs at any given time, is also a chaos strategist and does amazing work consulting in the restaurant industry and beyond. He is a coach to CEOs and people alike. So welcome, Fred LeFranc, my co-host.
Well, thank you. Let me return the favor by introducing Kristina Wiltsee, who's a perspective alchemist, who, if you have doubts and concerns about what's going on in your life, she can help you see it from a different angle. And she also does a lot of coaching for individuals and executives. That's how I met her. And is profound in her ability to provide great insight for someone that is in a state of confusion. So she brings clarity to many, many different things. And before we go even further, please make sure you subscribe to the Executive Mystic podcast found on your favorite channels. Could be YouTube, if you want to see our pretty faces, Spotify, Apple, and beyond. So let's get into it. So Kristina, what's today's topic? What are we talking about today?
So today we are going to do the second half of what we called our dialectics process, which is a fancy Buddhist term or Greek term for a debate. A debate that is, we are going to be debating specific principles. Like we did last time, we debated the principle of the universe is neutral. And the way that the structure of this works is that you do a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis. You basically try to have two opposing viewpoints and see how you can synthesize them together. And one of the things that we talk about with our ABCs is how important universal principles are. So we are bringing up universal principles. The universe is neutral. And what are we going to be talking about today, Fred? What specific principle?
Today we're talking about as above, so below. And going back, and thank you for bringing the ABC. So alignment, we always say, if you align to universal principles, your life will be a lot easier. You're not swimming upstream. You're basically going with the flow. And as we recall, balance is this embracement of the paradox, two opposing points of view, which we're going to be talking about today. And then ultimately, you do embrace both of them. That's the synthesis to get you to that third stage of coherence. So in as above, so below, it is a principle that says, as things appear in the macro, they also appear in the micro.
All right. Start us off, Fred. Go on. Go and tell us that thesis, that as above, so below malarkey.
So I'm gonna start by giving you some physical examples. So the first one is, if you look at the structure of the solar system, we have the sun in the middle, the planets orbiting, and then the moons around the planets. And that structure actually exists at the subatomic level. An atom will have a neutron and protons and everything just floating around in a similar structure and so forth and so on. And so there's a direct correspondence, on a very large scale and on a very small scale, as above, so below. The other thing that's kind of interesting is from religious symbology is the Star of David is an example of as above, so below. It's two triangles that intersect. One's facing up, one's facing down, and that's what forms the Star of David. So even there, it's embodied. That principle is embodied through this symbol that we know as the Star of David. And what I've always stated is that in an organizational culture, the thumbprint of the CEO is present throughout the entire culture. Whatever inner balance or lack of coherence that may exist within that leader exists within the culture. It's impossible to separate that because they show up and have such an incredible influence. And that's why the role of a leader is so critical, in my opinion, because they do set the tone for everybody else in terms of their behavior. If the leader behaves inappropriately, the culture follows that. If a leader has standards and has values and has guardrails for certain behaviors, then the culture will adopt that as well. And so that's part of what we're trying to do, is make sure we understand that, so that as we move forward in looking at this, these internal patterns will shape external outcomes. Now, I recognize that everything that we do in a company is not isolated internally. We are in an environment of business where there's economic, social upheaval, political upheaval, things like that. But I believe firmly in this case that the behavior of that leader will influence the outcomes that one's trying to achieve from that standpoint. And that would work in turnarounds, in branding, or scaling a business to make sure we can try and do that. So that's my quick summary of how it works.
All right. So your thesis is saying that what happens on the interior state of a leader is going to happen on the exterior late within their company. My argument against the law of correspondence, which is called, is that it originally comes from a Hermetic, it comes from the Hermetic tablets, which are called the Emerald tablets. And so very goes back to alchemy, right? And as I call myself an alchemist, you can probably tell where I stand on this in reality. But the thing is that if I wanted to make the most cohesive argument against this, I would say that humans have a tendency to see patterns where there aren't any patterns, because we're trying to make sense of the chaos. We're trying to say, okay, well, maybe there's some sort of through line in all of this randomness that's happening, and all of this randomness means something. And so, yes, I can see that there's biomimicry that happens mathematically between, a coastline versus something else mathematically that happens at a bigger scale or a smaller scale. Or I can see that there's electrostatic forces are going to mimic something that happens in the universe or something along those lines. But when you get into super complex systems, you can't just blanket statement this as above, so below, like what's happening on a small scale is happening on a big scale. And just because there are mathematical differences, we can't map complex systems. We can't map the weather systems of the entire United States to a degree of total reliability, let alone the world, because it is such a complex system. So it can't be like, oh, well, the whatever's happening at this town level is then going to be happening at this bigger level. And so my argument against this is that there's no guarantee that the mirroring of the interstate is going to match the market reality. I know plenty of really great leaders who have a lot of difficulty in their companies, regardless of how great they are as people. And so how is it that you're kind of correlating one thing that may have happened to them, which is then happening on this greater thing, when you can say it's anything? You could create any pattern you want to match that and completely throw out the rest of the data. But the best possible leaders have to take into account as much data as possible, as well as the constraints and externalities of randomness and chaos that happen all the time.
Well, in your rebuttal, you use a lot of physical examples, which I disagree with. What I'm referring to, even though I did start my example with the universe or the solar system, is that in an organization, there's no doubt that the attitudes, the awareness, the imprint of that leader affects culture dramatically. So when something external occurs, to your point toward the end, how the leader handles that, if he handles it or she handles it with equanimity versus panic, it's going to make a big difference. I mean, I always say that a leader during crisis should be like a lighthouse, and it should be that which sort of gives you grounded, casts the light, lets you know where you're at, versus hysteria. And if the leaders, I'll give you an example. When I fly on an airplane and there's turbulence, I always look to the stewardesses or the flight attendants. If they're panicked, I'm going to panic. If they're calm, in spite of the turbulence, then I figure everything's okay. And very much the same thing applies to a leader. And that's why a leader got just a critical role in terms of understanding how they must handle themselves, because all eyes are on the leader at all times. And so the corresponding energy from that leader will help people get through this challenging time. Because what we're really dealing with is that there's the external events that occur, and then there's the internal reaction and response to it. And the question is it a reaction, or are you choosing a response? The leader on the inside, and I've been in those roles before, sometimes could be just as freaked out as the employees. But if one understands the responsibility to exhibit calm and self-control during chaos, that's a big piece of it. And it actually, all these principles work with each other. They're combinatorial. We talked last time about the universe is neutral, where instead of diving into some catastrophe because we pick up the rope and go, oh my God, this is the worst thing that ever happened, we can stay calm and centered and say, nope, It's just an event. I should look at the scenarios and I can choose the response and I can choose to put my attention to the one that I want as an outcome.
Okay. Okay. So your rebuttal, you're basically saying that I'm using physical examples, and those physical examples are mathematics, which maybe, we don't have that full complexity yet. We don't quite understand a lot of that. But if you were to look at the internal state of a person, that internal state is then going to be mimicked outward, because the internal state is something that's psycho-spiritual, right? Like there's a level of energetics or something that we don't understand yet, that is going into creating that mimicking. And I think I could probably, I can see absolutely how a psycho-spiritual or more subtle field could affect everything around. But I think that this is where the limitation of as above, so below can happen in our world. Because, if I, this is, we've talked about this when it comes to ABCs, like we talk about universal principles and how if you have a small principle, a small self principle, right, which is everything has to be orderly, right? And everything has to be in its right place. That's a small self structure, right? That's something that you may have some version of perfectionism, or you didn't know how to handle the chaos, so you were just like, I need everything to be small. And then you take that small strategy, and then you decide that your entire company now everything has to be organized in your company. And as a result of that, you can't move forward because you're so caught up with organizing everything within the company and trying to find the perfect structure that you forget to sell, or you forget to kind of go out and do things, right? And so it's like there's a real stumbling block here, in that, like, if you're trying to use this as a principle for how you govern or lead in your company, like, you have to be really careful about what it is that you're magnifying on all these different layers, and recognize that it is such a complex system that, you can, even if you were just to apply it to strategy, like my personal strategy is to keep everything organized and my company strategy is to keep everything organized, the market's not going to agree with that. The market doesn't care if you're organized, right? Like maybe that means that, but who's to say what's perfect? Like who's to say whatever? And how are you guaranteeing that the strategy that you're amplifying is actually going to be the right strategy and isn't just going to be a small strategy, a self-limiting strategy, or company limiting strategy, right?
Yeah, and it's what's interesting is as I listen to your second rebuttal to my rebuttal, is it brings back that wonderful situation of paradox. This is another example of paradox, and I think for the listeners here, you can begin to see that both have validity. The question is under what circumstance and the conditions. And if it's as above, so below, and in some ways we're talking about a market which is external versus the culture which is internal, it's those kind of correspondence we're playing with. And I think the synthesis begins to resolve that potentially for us, so that we understand that none of this is meant to be dogmatic to the point of it has to work exactly the same way. If I go back to my solar system example, while the structure may be similar, the behavior of atoms is different than the behavior of suns and planets, because at scale, it does change. And here we're talking about how the internal coherence, which is what I'm discussing, influences behavior and culture. Okay. And I believe that to be true. And then what you're talking about, Kristina, because you gave the example of organization. The market doesn't care if you're organized. You're right. You're absolutely right. I think that external reality remains independent and constraining. And it's the relationship between the two that we're talking about balancing both extremes, is recognizing that while something from the outside can affect the business directly in a constraining way, the behavior on the inside can also affect or influence the effect of that, whether it destroys the business or it amplifies the business. That's why a healthy culture is so important, because a healthy culture, they'll rely on each other. They have each other's backs. If there's no moral compass, they just won't do that. Some external event occurs and they get all freaked out and make some bad things. So it's understanding to use this law of correspondence as a diagnostic, not dogma. It's not meant to decide things for you. I think in the example you use of the company being organized versus the outside market not caring, that may be true. but the fact that the company is organized and coherent will influence the effect of any external condition that may happen to the business so that people can find their way. And the wonderful thing about coherence, as we said before in our conversation about ABCs, is that when you have that inner certainty, the commitment to move forward, and the courage to enact the things that you believe to be true, then you find your way through. I keep on saying we live in a whitewater world, and we know that it's class 5 waves. We're going to hit a rock. It's not about if we're going to hit a rock. We're going to hit the rock. So make sure you're nimble. Make sure you're resilient. Make sure you're fluid in terms of your response to it. And this is really what we're talking about, is to understand that you control the inner world of yourself as an individual leader. It affects your culture. If the culture is aware of this, then the culture itself is self-reinforcing to make sure they're prepared to handle crazy market conditions, such as the ones that we see in the world today. And I think that this idea of pulling it together to have leadership development alignment work in response to external events is important in that regard. What are your thoughts about this that's there?
All right. So before I go my thoughts, we're going to go to break real quick. This episode is brought to you by Results Through Strategy. Since 2006, RTS has been the go-to partner for restaurants and food service brands, navigating growth, transformation, or recovery. Their team of seasoned industry veterans helps companies rediscover their purpose, realign with their values, and implement strategies that build measurable, sustainable performance. All right, so we're back. So to summarize what you're saying, Fred, is that effectively it sounds to me like the law of correspondence can almost be used as I say architecture, but like it's kind of a little bit like you're trying to almost create a system that is self-healing and self-resilient, right? In some ways, right? So it's like, and it starts with a leader that's coherent in the middle, which then affects its culture. And that culture then is able to buffer anything that happens as the outside world and external world interacts with it. Is that, would you say that that's accurate-ish?
Yeah, I'm gonna take my analogy even further. All right. I talked about water rafting. And I don't know, have you been whitewater rafting?
Many times. In fact, I did have a previous life in which I wanted to be a whitewater rafting person because I loved it so much. So yes.
All right. You'll appreciate this. So I was on a whitewater rafting trip. And what I'm really saying is that the raft, it represents the internal organization. The condition of the rivers is the external condition. You can't control that, right? In fact, you can't even really steer a raft. The current's going to take what it's going to take. You can kind of try and move around it. And so the raft is made of rubber. So when it hits the rock, it bounces off. If it was a wooden canoe, it would shatter. So I'm on a whitewater rafting trip. And this one instructor we had, thankfully, said, we're going to go over a 25-foot waterfall. And you're like, oh, shit. Okay. And he goes, so let me show you what you have to do. So he goes, when I tell you, you need to grab your paddle in one hand, grab the rope that goes all around the raft, and then get as low as you can the raft to create a lower center of gravity. Okay, do not sit up straight, go low. This is coherence. This is working within the constructs. He's a leader. He's instructing us on what to do. He's making sure we're prepared for this. And we rehearsed a few times. Okay, paddle in one hand, grab the rope, get down low. All right, now, so we're on the side of the shore waiting our turn to go through this 25-foot waterfall. Then all of a sudden we see this one raft go by, and this big macho guy's in the back, and you get a big burly man, and it is full of women. They're both full of women. And they're heading toward the raft, and of course, the waterfall. And as the raft goes over the waterfall, as you can imagine, all of a sudden it just disappears because it goes over the edge. As they go over the waterfall, all the women raise their paddles and arms up in the air in some form of celebration, like, woohoo, here we go, like you do on a roller coaster. And we were aghast because we'd just been lectured. Do not sit up straight, get low center of gravity, and especially hang on to that paddle because if it's flying around, it's going to hit someone and hurt them. And we were just like, oh my God, look what just happened. So then it was our turn. And as we get closer to the edge, and sure enough, the water's roiling and all that kind of stuff. Down low, grab the paddle in your hand, get the rope. and we go over the side. And when we go over the side, is a 25-foot drop is not short. It is 25 feet. And you go into the water. You are submerged into the water, the very bottom of the waterfall, where the water is, spooming up and everything like that. And then we bounce out of the water, and we're all in the boat. No one fell out, and we're all fine because we had held on to our paddles. And as we keep on going further, all the boats typically pull over to the side of the river to just sort of, relive the experience. So as we go over, we see the women that had gone over with their arms and paddles in the air. Head lacerations, bleeding. One woman had a broken arm. It was bad. It was ugly. And that's the best example I could give to you of what happens when you don't have coherence, when you don't understand that you can internally change your approach to an external condition, in this case, a 25-foot waterfall, and end up in a very different state. And that's why I believe that in terms of this law of correspondence, the internal coherence is absolutely critical to deal with the external constraint that's been thrust upon you so that you can influence the outcome. None of us were hurt. And here you had, broken arms and bleeding and all that kind of stuff. So that's sort of my example of how that metaphor goes beyond just a metaphor to reality. And in business, keeping the culture tight and intact and aligned to the values that it stands for, the principles of why it's business, its purpose is probably the bigger one, will help you manage the things. We saw that in COVID. COVID, the companies that had the healthiest cultures came out and thrived. The companies that were toxic did not. And anytime a company's placed under stress, and frankly, in this environment we're working in, there's just a lot of stuff that's going on economically, politically, tariffs, this and that we have to be mindful of. And it's about just really knowing when to, again, hang on, duck, and stay tight as a team during this turbulent times that we live in.
Okay. And so to kind of further the synthesis of how do you exist with both, right? How do you recognize that there are complex systems, that you do need to be careful about what you're magnifying, if this is this as above, so below, and that there is a limitation with how far this principle can go, at least to our brains, right? At least to our comprehension. Very similar to weather patterns. It's like, we can't even create the models that fully model the whole world because it is such a complex system. Yet, sure, we may be able to do that. One of the things that comes to mind to me is this idea that, that your argument is very clear that says that, creating coherence and as above, so below, as far as the reach of a single person and leader and that company can have as an impact in the world, is where you draw the constraint or the limitation for how this kind of principle applies. And I would extend that in the sense that, there's a kind of more extreme version of this, the thesis, which is that everything is a pattern, and the antithesis, which is that nothing is a pattern and we are predisposed to see patterns, is like, what if we recognize that we don't currently have the computing power to be able to understand all of the patterns that are going on around us, right? There are people, I would consider myself one of them, who specialize in trying to see those patterns. Before, it was like the oracles, and it was the things, and it was all these other people like seeing this kind of meta pattern recognition. And that if we were to totally throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to patterns and say, no, nothing's a pattern, it is all chaos, you wouldn't also be good at your job, which is a chaos strategist, which is that, yes, there are patterns that work when you apply them, right? Like, you've seen companies and you've seen them. I'm sure that in some ways, none of them have dissolved in quite the same way, but they've probably all dissolved from a very consistent form of inputs or lack of inputs, in such a way that you're able to navigate in your job through the chaos of what all the data and all the different things, and find a pattern and find a path, because you've seen that pattern before, because your mind is able to comprehend that. And so we kind of both do that in our different ways. And so if we say, yeah, maybe everything is a pattern and we can't see it yet, we can't figure that out yet. Some of us are predisposed for that kind of pattern recognition and may be able to see something bigger. But it's also not that there aren't any patterns. It's this middle ground of how can patterns work for you? right?
It's conditional correspondence. I
Mhm.
joke about if I walk into a room full of shit, I can find the pony and ride out. Because I can see the pattern. I mean, just like follow the organization. The pattern does not say that well, I always talk about bringing order to disorder.
Mhm.
It does not mean that you resolve everything. It means that you find a way through it.
Mhm.
Okay. And that's really what it comes down to. If I use another metaphor of walking on a tightrope, there's a lot of ways to fall off. There is one way across. Focus on the one way across and ignore the externals that may knock you off. And I think that when you have this understanding that the internal coherence of correspondence helps you be prepared to deal with the external circumstance, the antithesis is really be aware of the market realism. Okay, that it's going, things will affect you and you cannot control what they do to you, but you can only control your response to it, very much like the Stoics talk about. And I think that's really where it becomes somewhat, the synthesis allows us to make it transformational. So you have coherence plus the competence equals the performance of the business overall. And one as the leader that is the role of the leader, is to make sure you guide people through the uncertainty by how you handle it yourself. It doesn't mean on the inside you're not a nervous wreck, but it means that you have to make the choices and recognize the influence you have on the people immediately under your care to lead them through these challenges. The best leaders that I have seen are just amazing at how they can allay people's fears so that they can focus on what they're capable of doing instead of focusing on what they feel they can't do. And it goes back to our victim victor, right? If you're a victim as a leader, your entire company is going to be victimized. But if you are as a leader saying, I may not have complete, the classic, I may be certain, but I may not be right. I may not know 100% that this is going to be the right thing to do, but I'm choosing the best outcome I think we can do. And we're going to move forward with certainty and conviction and commitment to be able to do that. And in my experience, the leaders that do that, while I may not be perfect, they will come out of it okay overall. Maybe a little battered, but not bloodied and broken bones.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I hear that. So if I were to, so we know coherence is a way that as above, so below can coherence and culture, which is what we talk about a lot, are kind of ways in which this as above, so below can work, which basically means leaders, you got to get your act together. Like you got to get into a space where you feel good and you got to do things like that. But I also want to look at other ways in which as above, so below could possibly be applied to a business. And one of the things that first came to mind when I'm thinking about this and listening to you is the idea of how you treat people, right? How you fundamentally treat people, because it's one thing to have coherence. And if you get into the real deep aspects of a lot of meditation practices, what you recognize is that coherence is very, very difficult when you are living in a hierarchy in which you think you're better than somebody, or there's like internal dissonance that's happening inside of your body. We won't get into that. That's we do an entire episode on that, but we won't, right. I mean, that's like the Bhagavad, it's like every single spiritual, especially Eastern source ever. But fundamentally, how you treat people. So how you treat yourself internally is going to be mimicked on this, how you treat your family, right? How you treat your employees, how you treat your customers, right? There's this recognition of fundamentally, are you creating power dynamics as an example? That's one of those very old school archetypal, like, yep, we all know this. We've all seen this person who likes to dominate everybody. They probably have an internal system of dominance within them. They may dominate their family. They may, then dominate their employees and just be like, I'm in charge here. This is everything. Like, I'm the one who's going to do this. And then they in turn may dominate or see their customers as lower than or stupid or any of these different things. And if we recognize that you can address that issue at any level, right? You can create a policy in your company which says our vendors and our customers and our employees are stakeholders that we actually care about, right? This is a concept in conscious capitalism, right? Stakeholder management, this idea that like everybody is absolutely fundamental.
Everyone
Everybody has Everyone has to win. That includes you as a leader. I think that's a really important aspect, right? Is that if you see as above, so below, what does that actually mean, as above, so below? Like, there are some interpretations of this concept which talks about, well, whatever happens in heaven happens on earth. Okay, that's one spiritual interpretation of it. Above can also be thought of as anything in the external world is anything in the internal world below, right? Like, you are the below, like you are kind of below the surface. Whatever's happening below the surface is going to be happening on the external thing, which is kind of what Fred's been talking about. So stakeholder management can be extended beyond customers, vendors, employees, to the self. How are you treating yourself in your own internal space? Right? Are you in the internal drama triangle, which we've mentioned in a previous episode? Are you doing something like that, which means that you are not actually you're being sacrificial in your leadership, right? Or you are, not being consistent with how everybody is being treated. That's an example of as above, so below that I think you could spend years just on that, just on working to treat everybody with basic humanity and everybody to win, right, Fred?
Yeah, no, I think you brought up stakeholder mentality, which is part of conscious capitalism's credo, and where everyone wins. It is yourself, the employees, the vendors, your customers, and the community. And if they all win, that's swimming with the current. When you're trying to do something that ultimately is bad. I mean, let's take the old example of the industrial age is that they're making all these great products for people to use while they were polluting rivers. And so they're destroying the environment, and that was taken into consideration. That ultimately proved to be a fallacy, because the community was suffering because of this toxic environment that was being done. When they started having a broader perspective that no, we have to keep the environment clean and safe for everyone to live around. The famous Aaron Brockovich story, right, where all these people are getting sick because of the output from these plants. That's what we're talking about here. And that's what the correspondence does work, because that kindness, the consideration for oneself, family, for others is extended in such a way that as a result, you get rewarded for that. And the best companies do, in fact, get the best customer loyalty, employee loyalty, best performance financially, because they are not doing anything at the expense of someone else. They are reinforcing the positive aspects of it. And that's what that correspondence does, in fact, prove itself to be true. It gets magnified in a really powerful way.
Yep. And it's an interesting thing. And I'm glad you brought up the environment, because I think that that's a stakeholder that we don't actually bring up enough. And I think that that's a statement that speaks broadly to even my mentality. For me, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't bring up the environment. Like, the earth is absolutely a stakeholder, guys, if not the most important stakeholder, because it's the one that sustains us. But I think, to your point, this is, the idea of stakeholder mentality and what are you doing? I'll give you an example of something that's happened in my work recently. Is that for me, I understand psychology of what it means to be an authentic person and also have to appear in content, right? Like, have to appear as somebody with a certain personality. And, I've gotten some funny feedback recently where people are like, well, yeah, you're like 120% authentic. Like, what are you doing on any given day? Like, it's just whatever happens to come into your mind. You're just like, I'm going to make a video about this, right? It can be very funny in that way. But at the same time, I also know and I'm trying to incorporate in whatever way feels authentic to me, the kind of standard tools, the hooks, the different things that make it so that people actually gather attention. Because, I, on the one level, really want to be authentic. And if I'm then going out in content and being inauthentic and being like, I'm here to capture your attention, hey, look at me, that can feel inauthentic, right? And so for me, as a person who's a persona who appears in kind of many places publicly, and my story is out there a lot, right? How do I integrate that kind of external appearance with the tools, the psychological tools that I know are used to manipulate attention, right? Is that inauthentic to do that? Or is it inauthentic to kind of claim that I'm around or different from that, given that I have a content. Do you kind of see what I'm saying in terms of this idea of like, what is authenticity? And like, are you then compromising that paradox of like, am I then, compromising myself if I kind of come out a couple of layers and actually you're being totally inauthentic and you are absolutely taking people's attention just so that you can get it, right?
Well, I mean, I think the thing about authenticity is that it's either smells right or it doesn't smell right, and people will sense that.
Yes.
There's enough people who proselytize and get on social media and make things sound like incredible, and the Instagram life is not real. But if we're sharing ideas like we are here in this podcast that are meant to sort of talk about what's behind the curtain, instead of making it sound like everything's great, everything's perfect, everything's wonderful, then I think it's authentic, and the authenticity rings true. That does correspond up and down and all around. There's no way to avoid that. And we're hoping to present through our conversations some opposing views as a dialogue, much more than a debate. We are sort of suspending our position and discussing an idea, and we'll address and rebut the idea, the conversation around the idea, not address and rebut each other as individuals. And I think you can absolutely have, using modern media, social media, whatever it is that you're using to express an idea that's really part of it. I mean, let's face it, the origins of this podcast came out of deeply personal conversations between you and I. And we finally said, you know what? There's other people that may benefit from this as well. And my attitude has always been, I'm not looking to say we're going to get 1 million followers. I'm not trying to unseat Joe Rogan. If we end up with 50 people who listen to this and value it and helps them in their lives, then we've done what we needed to do. It doesn't have to be beyond that. It's a different vision of what we see as success in this regard.
Yes. And so as we move to align the internal authentic state with what feels like an external authentic state, right? Even if it means that you're having to maybe take on an identity or persona that doesn't feel totally comfortable, right? I know there's a lot of leaders who are extremely introverted, right? Mm-hmm. And having the idea of having to go out and, obviously public speaking is sometimes easier for introverts, but, the idea of having to schmooze or the idea of having to do all these different things may feel inauthentic or that you're having to put on a persona. But I think it's really important to recognize that, we are adaptive beings and you can be authentic in and of yourself and also be authentic in your desire to see success on an external level, right? And so yes, you're taking on a persona, but the desire to take on the persona to be able to be to authentically have something succeed is authentic. Does that make sense?
Totally. It makes all the sense. I mean, I've revealed things that have happened to me personally that I'd rather not talk about because I'm a private person, but I'm convinced that it's for the greater good that might be able to help someone else. And so I can overcome my personal discomfort because I think it's going to benefit someone else.
Yep. Absolutely. So any final thoughts you have, Fred, on our synthesis as above, so below conversation?
No, I think we continue to explore these various principles that we tell people to be aligned with and recognize that it is a combination of the ABCs. It's that embracing the paradox. And then ultimately, we'll talk more and more about the courage to move forward with the coherence, even though the external world's screaming at you. And so I'm happy that we have this ongoing dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you. And also please be sure to hit the subscribe button or the follow button, depending on whatever platform you are. And you can send us an email at growth@theexecutiveandthemystic.com if you would like to have any feedback or even come on and talk to us. We would love to hear how you have integrated spirituality and business, or how you integrate principles, or how you use the ABCs, or how you would want to. And we will be happy to hear from you.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. The Executive and the Mystic podcast, co-hosted by Fred LeFranc and Kristina Wiltsee, where wisdom meets business.